The corridors stretched silent, their emptiness broken only by the faint hum of stillness that pressed into the ears like a weight. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and something older, something that clung to the walls as though it had soaked into the stone itself. Shadows leaned across the floor in uneven patterns, cast by windows whose glass was cracked and dust-blind, filtering in a gray light that did little to push away the darkness. Every surface bore the mark of abandonment. Paint curled in strips, plaster sagged in places like hanging skin, and the ceiling seemed to bow under the weight of time. Yet nothing in this place felt lifeless. The stillness was deceptive. It carried a tension that suggested awareness, a quiet waiting, as though something within the walls remembered the presence of those who had once walked here, and resented the intrusion now. The deeper one went, the more the silence revealed its fractures. At first there were only faint sounds, a soft tapping, too deliberate to be the settling of a building, too irregular to be explained by wind. It echoed from nowhere and everywhere, a subtle rhythm that followed each step like a response, a mimicry that never quite aligned. Then came the distant dripping, a single drop of water striking stone in intervals that stretched long and uneven, each impact startling in its clarity against the oppressive quiet. It seemed impossible to know if the drip was ahead, behind, or within the very walls. The ear strained to place it, but it always slipped away, always vanished into stillness before it could be caught. The air grew colder. It wasn't the kind of cold that came with a draft or a shift in weather. It was sudden, invasive, sinking through fabric into skin and deeper still, into bone. It was a chill that seemed to breathe, rising and falling faintly, as though exhaled by something hidden nearby. Along the corridor, doors stood ajar, some yawning open into rooms that were darker than the hall itself, others closed tightly but trembling slightly on their hinges, as if something shifted within. The sight of the half-open doors gave the impression of mouths, waiting silently, their dark interiors watching. To look too long at one filled the chest with a pressure, a dread that something would move within the black, something that was already there, holding perfectly still, aware of being seen. The walls bore marks, faint but unmistakable, long lines etched into plaster, uneven and jagged as though something sharp had scraped along with slow determination. Some lines ran high, some low, their patterns chaotic but always clustered near the edges, near the corners where the shadows thickened. Along the floor, stains spread outward, faded and dark, impossible to identify yet impossible to dismiss. They reached in uneven arcs, some smeared as though dragged, others pooled and unmoving. The scent of rust was stronger here, bitter and metallic, clinging to the air like the echo of something that had not yet left. The silence broke with suddenness, a low groan that trembled through the building itself, vibrating in the walls and the floor beneath. It was not the sound of wood or stone settling. It carried a resonance, a hollow depth, like the moan of something alive forced through narrow spaces. The sound lingered, reverberating long after it should have faded, as though the building itself had spoken. And when it ended, the silence that followed was worse, deeper, charged, as if holding its breath. That was when the footsteps began. They were faint, distant but unmistakable, slow, deliberate, each one placed with intent. They did not rush or falter. They moved with patience, a measured rhythm that grew louder and softer as though circling unseen. The sound never aligned with the corridors ahead. It echoed from behind, then from the side, then from somewhere above, as if whatever made it walked freely between spaces unseen. Each step was heavier than the last, pressing into the silence until the sound seemed almost inside the chest rather than in the hall. When the footsteps paused, so did the air, and the oppressive awareness of being watched tightened, a weight upon the back of the neck, as though unseen eyes traced every movement, waiting for the next sound. The windows along the corridor grew fewer, their faint light dying away until only the dim glow of failing bulbs overhead offered resistance against the dark. They flickered weakly, buzzing faintly as though straining against some force. With each flicker, the shadows shifted unnaturally, stretching too far, retreating too slow, lagging behind as if reluctant to move. Corners grew darker, pooling black that no light touched, black that seemed to deepen the longer one stared. At times the blackness trembled faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if something stirred within it, waiting for the next moment the light would fail. Rooms opened along the passage, each one filled with silence thicker than the hall outside. Some held broken furniture, their outlines hunched and strange in the shadows, their forms distorted so they resembled figures crouched in wait. Others were empty, bare floors stretching into corners too dark to see, yet carrying the suffocating sense of occupancy, as though something lurked just out of sight, perfectly still, perfectly aware. Sounds leaked from these rooms, faint scratching against stone, the rustle of fabric, the shallow intake of breath, but only when not directly watched. The moment the doorway was faced, silence returned, heavy and unbroken, leaving only the certainty that the sound had been real. The deeper the passage wound, the more the space itself seemed to shift. Steps taken forward led to familiar corners, the same peeling door frames, the same cracks in the floor, yet details altered each time. A stain that spread wider, a scrape on the wall longer than before, a shadow in the corner where none had been. The repetition was disorienting, a looping maze of sameness that never truly repeated. Time slipped strangely here. It became unclear whether minutes or hours passed, whether each step brought progress or only further descent into something endless. The weight of the air pressed heavier, the cold sharper, until each breath felt like inhaling frost. The sounds grew closer, the scraping returned, louder now, as though metal dragged against stone only a short distance ahead. It was slow, halting, deliberate, a rhythm that spoke not of accident but of intent. The whispers followed. They came faintly at first, a rustle at the edge of hearing, then clearer, though never enough to be understood. They wove through the silence like threads, voices overlapping, rising and falling as though in hushed conversation. They never addressed directly, but they circled, testing the edges of comprehension, their cadence heavy with warning, or perhaps with invitation. Listening too closely brought a chill deeper than the air, a sense that to understand them fully would mean never leaving. The architecture changed subtly. Walls bowed inward, ceilings lowered, the corridor narrowing until it pressed close, suffocating. The floor tilted, not enough to stumble but enough to feel pulled downward, as if gravity shifted here, drawing everything deeper into the wing. The lights flickered more often, their buzzing more frantic until stretches of hall lay in near total darkness broken only by brief, violent flashes. Each flash revealed something different. Shadows stretched against the walls in shapes that did not belong to the corridor, stains shifting position, doors open that had been closed only moments before. In the instant between light and dark, the mind filled the void with movement. The certainty of figures retreating just out of sight, lingering at the edges, waiting for the next flash to reveal them again. The silence was no longer silence. It was filled with breath, heavy and uneven, sometimes above, sometimes from behind, always close. It grew louder in the pauses between other sounds, swelling to fill the void, pressing against the ears as though breathed directly into them. The cold deepened into something painful, seeping into bone, numbing fingers, tightening the chest. The smell thickened, metallic and sour, mingled with the damp rot of something long sealed away. Each inhale carried with it the taste of rust, the faint bitterness of decay, impossible to escape. The corridor finally ended in a door. It was different from the others, heavier, its wood darkened not just with time but with stains that reached outward across the frame. The handle was rusted, corroded, yet faintly damp as though touched moments before. The air here was colder still, biting, filled with a stillness that felt too absolute, as if even the walls held their breath. Beyond the door came a sound, faint, dragging, like something heavy being pulled slowly across stone. It stopped, then resumed closer, then paused again, waiting. The sense of being watched was unbearable now, not just from behind, not just from above, but from every direction, as though unseen eyes filled the very walls, closing in, patient and endless. When the door creaked open, the darkness beyond was absolute, a void that consumed the failing light behind. The air that spilled out was colder than any before, wet and heavy, carrying the thick stench of rot and rust. The space beyond felt vast, larger than the building should allow, its dimensions obscured by the black. Yet within that void, sounds stirred. Slow shuffling, faint scratching, the low resonance of something vast shifting in silence. The breath returned, deeper now, rolling through the darkness, shaking the walls with its weight. The whispers rose with it, no longer faint but insistent, layered upon one another. A chorus of voices circling, pressing against the mind, pulling thought away from itself. They grew louder, closer, until they became almost intelligible, almost forming words that strained at the edge of understanding, words that should never be spoken aloud. The black pressed inward. It did not simply fill the space, it consumed it, swallowing the walls, the floor, the very light itself. Shapes stirred within it, faint at first, then clearer with each flicker of failing bulbs behind. They were tall, uneven, hunched and shuddering, their outlines wrong, bending where no body should bend, shifting with each glimpse. They did not move toward the light, not fully, but they watched. Their presence was undeniable, heavy, suffocating, filling the chest with the weight of inevitability. The whispers became sharper, clearer, their tones urgent, frantic, overlapping until they no longer resembled voices but the shriek of wind through broken stone. The breath grew deeper, louder, vibrating through the floor, rattling the bones, pressing against the heart with a force that demanded silence, demanded stillness. And then came the sound of closing, not the door but the corridors behind. A shuddering slam echoed from the halls, then another, each one sealing shut, cutting off retreat. The darkness ahead swelled, rising like a tide, the shadows stretching out, reaching with deliberate patience. The cold thickened until the air itself seemed to freeze, the breath in the lungs burning as it turned to frost. The whispers reached their crescendo, not words but a cacophony, a storm of sound that pressed into the skull, breaking thought, shattering silence, leaving only dread, only the awareness of something vast, ancient, and awake within the forgotten wing. The last light flickered once, twice, then died. Darkness fell, complete and suffocating. The breath was everywhere now, surrounding, pressing close, drawn deep and slow. The inhale of something immense preparing to exhale. And within that suffocating black, the final sound came. Not a whisper, not a scrape, not a footstep. It was laughter. Low, hollow, and endless, rising from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. Laughter that did not belong to a voice, but to the place itself. The sound of the forgotten wing remembering and refusing to ever let go. Story 2. The hallways were not meant to be found. They stretched beyond the familiar sections, hidden behind walls that did not line up, behind staircases that seemed too short, behind locked doors that should never have been opened. What lay beyond carried no sense of belonging to the rest of the place. It was different, wrong. It carried a silence that did not wait to be broken but insisted upon itself, a silence that consumed every sound before it could even echo. Stepping into it was like stepping out of time, into a part of the world deliberately severed and sealed away, a part meant to be forgotten. The walls were narrow and uneven, damp with condensation that glistened faintly in the failing light of old bulbs overhead. Each bulb flickered on its own rhythm, none steady. creating a dissonance that left no corner fully lit. The shadows shifted constantly, crawling across the plaster in irregular waves, never aligning, never still. Beneath it all was the sound, the faint hum of electricity, broken at intervals by sudden sharp bursts of silence when the bulbs faltered together. Those brief moments of absolute blackness stretched longer than they should have, as though the darkness wanted to linger, wanted to stay even after the light returned. The air was heavy, thick. Each breath tasted of iron and mildew, damp earth and rust. It clung to the tongue, made the lungs ache as though breathing something unfit to sustain life. The corridors carried no windows here, no draft of air to remind the body of the world beyond. The temperature shifted without warning. At times the cold was unbearable, pressing against the bones, burning as though the air itself froze with intent. At other times, heat swelled suddenly, oppressive and wet, carrying the sour stench of decay until the stomach twisted and breath faltered. Neither condition lasted long, but both left the body unsettled, trapped in a cycle of extremes with no rhythm, no reason. The floors creaked faintly beneath each step, yet the sound was never quite one's own. Sometimes the creak lingered a moment longer, as though something heavier had shifted just behind. Other times, the sound came from further ahead, a groaning sigh from the boards as though something unseen waited in the dark, rocking its weight slowly back and forth. The sound of dripping water returned too, but differently here. It no longer echoed with distance. It was near, very near. At times the drops struck close enough that a faint spray touched the skin, though no leak, no pipe, no ceiling fracture was visible above. The droplets fell from nowhere, their rhythm broken, their presence impossible, and yet they stained the wood with widening dark circles, wetting the surface as though the building itself wept quietly in the shadows. Along the walls, strange marks appeared. They were not scratches, not deliberate carvings, but something else. Stains that stretched upward like veins, branching in jagged directions, twisting across plaster and sinking into cracks. They seemed to pulse faintly in the corner of sight, darker one moment, lighter the next, always shifting when not directly watched. Some ran into the ceiling, disappearing into black. Others pooled along the floor, forming irregular patches that resembled spreading shadows. At times, the shapes they made looked like figures, reaching arms, twisted faces, but only for an instant before bleeding back into formless stains. Doors lined the passage here too, though none were ordinary. Some were sealed completely, their frames buried in plaster as though the building itself had tried to hide them away. Others stood half open, leading only into voids of complete darkness that swallowed all light, so black that even the eye refused to adjust. Faint sounds leaked from behind them, a dull thud, repeated slowly as though something heavy swayed back and forth. A whisper so faint it could not be separated from the breath of the listener, always on the edge of clarity, vanishing the moment focus tried to catch it. And sometimes the unmistakable sound of breathing, drawn long and slow, inhaled with effort, exhaled with a weight that seemed to carry centuries of dust. The corridor turned upon itself again and again, but the sense of direction slipped away. Corners repeated, yet altered. One hallway held a crack across the ceiling, thick and jagged, and returning later, the crack was wider, darker, pulsing faintly as though something beneath strained to push through. Another hall held a single broken chair against the wall. Returning, the chair was overturned. Returning again, it was gone completely. The building rearranged itself, or something rearranged it. The mind faltered, unable to trust what had been seen moments before. The only certainty was that it wanted to confuse, to draw deeper, to erase the possibility of return. The silence was not empty, it was crowded. It carried the sense of presence, of countless unseen forms pressed into the blackness, waiting with patience too deep to measure. The weight of their attention was constant, pushing against the back of the neck, settling heavy on the chest. Sometimes it grew so intense that breath came in shallow gasps, every inhale sharp with fear, every exhale trembling as though something might hear. And it did hear, for every pause brought reply. Stop, and the distant shuffle stopped too. Hold breath, and silence deepened until the faintest beat of a heart sounded like thunder. Move again, and something moved with it, slower, deliberate, matching in rhythm but never in step. The light bulbs faltered more often now. Their glow dimmed, stretched thin, leaving longer spans of black between flickers. In those gaps things stirred. Shadows not cast by any object drifted across the walls, tall and shuddering, bending where no body should bend. Figures hung in the air, elongated, twitching faintly as though strung on invisible lines. The mind rejected them, insisted they were tricks of the dark, but the body knew better. The skin crawled, hair rose, muscles tensed without command. And when the light returned, the walls bore new stains, fresh and wet, running downward in lines that glistened as though newly painted. The sound changed. It grew louder, nearer. Not footsteps now, but dragging, something heavy, uneven, scraping across the floor just beyond the bend of the corridor. The rhythm was unnatural, halting as though the weight shifted on surfaces not meant to carry it. The drag came closer, then stopped, leaving silence too sudden, too sharp. The cold grew unbearable. It clung to the throat, stung the eyes, left the breath visible in thin trails of frost that lingered too long in the air. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting. A door ahead stood half open, its frame twisted as though forced by something too wide to pass cleanly through. Darkness swelled beyond it, heavier than before, a black that pressed outward into the hall, swallowing the light until even the flickering bulbs retreated. From within came a sound unlike the others, not dragging, not whispering, but a low resonance that trembled through the floor, through the ribs, through the skull itself. It was not a voice, not in the way a voice should be, but it carried the weight of intention. It filled the space with a command that had no words, only presence. Step closer, enter, become part of the silence. The air thickened until every breath was a struggle. The eyes watered, the chest ached, and still the pull deepened. Insistent, patient. The sound rose again, louder, shaking dust from the ceiling, rattling the broken glass on the floor, vibrating in bone until thought itself began to fracture. And then the whispers returned. Not distant now, but close, inside the ears, threading through the mind in voices layered upon voices. They spoke in tones that had no beginning and no end, a chorus of murmurs that grew clearer with every second. They spoke of doors that should never have been opened, of halls that should never have been found, of a wing sealed not because it was forgotten, but because it was remembered too well. The corridor behind was gone. Where the passage should have been was only black, a depth that offered no distance, no shape, no chance of return. The only way was forward, toward the waiting door, toward the sound that vibrated like a living heart within the dark. The whispers grew frantic, pulling in every direction, some urging to flee though there was nowhere to go, others urging to enter, to join, to end the weight of waiting. The air pulsed in time with the resonance, in and out, like the slow inhale and exhale of a sleeping thing. But it was not sleeping. It was awake, watching. The last light flickered, then burned out. Complete darkness filled the space, heavy, absolute. The whispers cut off at once, leaving only the sound of breathing, impossibly close, drawn deep, exhaled with the weight of centuries. And then came the final sound, the slow, deliberate closing of the door. Not by hand, not by force, but by the building itself. It groaned inward, sealing away the last trace of outside, locking the air in place. The forgotten wing had taken one more step toward being remembered, and it would never let go. Story 3, the entrance to the wing was not marked. It stood at the end of a narrow hall, its door half buried in shadow. A part of the building that seemed to withdraw from sight even when directly faced. The frame sagged, the handle was cold with corrosion, and the wood bore stains that had seeped too deep to fade. No sign identified where it led. No memory explained why it existed. It was simply there, hidden in plain sight, waiting with a stillness that felt wrong. The silence behind it was heavier than the silence outside, as though the air itself braced against what lay within. Crossing that threshold meant leaving behind the ordinary quiet. Inside, the silence was different. It was not emptiness, it was density. A silence that carried weight, pressing into ears and chest until every sound of the body felt magnified, unbearable. The faint thump of a heart echoed like a drum. The intake of breath rasped as though dragged through stone. The shift of fabric whispered with betrayal. Every motion, every sound, every beat was too loud here, as though the wing demanded absolute stillness and resented every failure to provide it. The corridor stretched forward in oppressive monotony. Walls lined with peeling plaster leaned inward slightly, their cracks forming crooked patterns that branched like veins. The floor was uneven, covered in dust that clung thick to each step, muffling sound but marking movement with a trail too clear to ignore. The ceiling sagged low, beams blackened by age, dripping condensation that struck the floor in uneven taps. Each drop echoed unnaturally, a sharp metallic ring that lingered far too long, as though the sound itself refused to fade. The air carried no circulation. It was stale, filled with the stagnant reek of mold and something sharper, metallic, bitter on the tongue. It clung to skin like a damp film, a weight that could not be brushed away. Every inhale burned faintly, carrying the suggestion of decay. The lungs protested, yet the body breathed deeper despite itself, pulled by something that seemed to move within the air, unseen currents that coaxed each breath heavier, deeper, slower, as if drawing life not for the body but for something else. The shadows did not sit still. They stretched unnaturally along the walls, cast by nothing visible, shifting in rhythm with the flickering bulbs above. Yet their movements were not bound to the light. They lagged. They twisted. At times they moved independently, rising or curling inward when the bulbs burned steady, then freezing again the instant eyes fixed upon them. Corners grew darker as though thickened with liquid shadow, black that pooled and stirred, trembling faintly as if something submerged within it strained to surface. Sounds returned, faint at first, a low groan from the walls, deep and resonant, as if the structure itself exhaled. A faint shuffle across the floor, distant yet measured, heavy enough to vibrate dust loose from the ceiling. Then the scratching began. It came from behind the walls, nails or metal dragged in slow, deliberate arcs, always longer than expected, always continuing beyond the length of the corridor. The noise rose and fell in waves, at times so faint it could be dismissed, at times so sharp it cut through thought like a blade, sending the heart hammering against the ribs. The scratches always moved, never still, circling unseen, following in patterns that suggested not accident but intent. Doors punctuated the hallway, unevenly spaced, their frames splintered, their hinges rusted. Some hung open, yawning into blackness that refused to yield depth. Others were closed but trembled faintly, as if something within leaned against them from the other side, patient and waiting. At times faint sounds seeped through, breathing long and slow, the rasp of fabric against stone, the soft scrape of something dragged across the floor. Placing an ear close revealed nothing. The moment the focus narrowed, the moment the sound was sought, silence fell absolute. But the pressure remained, a certainty that listening too long would be answered not with sound but with something far worse. The deeper the path stretched, the more the building shifted. What had seemed solid became unstable. The floor sloped downward subtly, enough to tilt balance, enough to create the sensation of being pulled forward. The air grew colder in waves, a chill that sank into muscle and bone, burning with sharp intensity before ebbing, only to return stronger. The walls seemed to press inward, closer, as though the space narrowed while the ceiling lowered with each step. Time fractured, the repetition of corridors, The sameness of peeling paint and sagging beams blurred moments together until minutes became hours or hours became seconds. There was no way to measure. The only measure was the increasing dread, the weight of it deepening, the certainty growing that there was no way back. Light failed more often here. Bulbs flickered longer before returning, their buzzing frantic, their glow stretched thin. In the moments of total dark, the silence broke. Heavy footsteps landed close, deliberate, vibrating through the floor. Breath rushed in slow exhale, impossibly near, moist against the ear. Whispers brushed faintly across the skin, layered and urgent, though never clear enough to form words. When the light returned, the corridor remained empty, but dust disturbed itself on the floor. Faint tracks where none should be, fresh stains on the wall where none had been before. The place was not empty. It never had been. Whispers grew bolder. They did not remain at the edge of hearing now, but pressed directly into the mind as though bypassing ears entirely. They wove together, dozens layered upon dozens, rising and falling in chaotic rhythm. Some hissed sharp, some murmured low, some laughed hollowly in tones that carried no mirth. They overlapped until meaning became impossible, yet intent was undeniable. They warned and beckoned, threatened and invited, a chorus that had no single voice yet carried one thought: you are not alone here, and you will not leave as you came. Stains along the walls changed. No longer vague, they took form, stretching into outlines of limbs. Faces twisted in silence, bodies half-formed as though pressed into the plaster from the other side. Their features were indistinct yet undeniable, mouths open in frozen cries, eyes dark voids that reflected nothing. They shifted when not watched, their positions different when glanced at again, their shapes closer, more distinct, more alive. The ceiling dripped steadily now, water or something thicker, falling in irregular taps, staining the dust with dark circles that spread too quickly, too wide, forming shapes that resembled footprints leading nowhere. The corridor opened suddenly into a larger space, a chamber that should not exist within the structure. Its ceiling rose higher, disappearing into black. Its walls stretched outward, lined with doors that hung broken or sealed in twisted frames. The floor bore marks, deep gouges that ran in parallel lines, intersecting at jagged angles, as though something massive had been dragged again and again across it. Pools of liquid gathered in the grooves, dark and reflective, though no reflection returned when gazed into. Instead, the surface seemed to ripple faintly, as though stirred from below. From above came sound, slow, deliberate thuds that vibrated the air, each one heavier than the last, as if something paced in circles unseen in the dark overhead. The rhythm was uneven, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always purposeful, always circling. The air grew thicker, pressing against the chest, making each breath a labor. The whispers grew into a hum, a vibration that filled the chamber until it seemed the walls themselves spoke, their plaster trembling with each syllable unheard. The cold reached its peak here, cutting through skin, seizing joints, biting into marrow. Frost formed along the edges of the doors, spreading outward in delicate branching patterns that resembled skeletal hands reaching across the surface. At the center of the chamber stood something that had not been there before, a shape, tall and narrow, rising from the floor like a pillar. It was formed not of stone or wood but of shadow, dense and solid, trembling faintly as though alive. Its surface writhed subtly, shapes pressing outward then sinking back. Too quick to identify, too terrible to confirm. The whispers grew louder near it, clearer, though still without meaning, as if the very presence of the shape drew the voices together, amplified them, yet twisted them beyond comprehension. The air around it pulsed, rising and falling like breath, pulling inward, exhaling outward, dragging the chill deeper with every cycle. The corridor behind was gone. Where the passage had stretched before, there was only wall now, seamless, unbroken, as though it had never existed. The only direction was forward, deeper into the chamber, closer to the shadow that loomed at its heart. The whispers demanded, the air compelled. The body moved though the mind resisted, drawn closer step by step, each footfall echoing far too loudly, each pause met with a silence so absolute it crushed thought itself. The shadow pulsed once, and the lights overhead shattered. Glass rained down in silence, shards scattering across the floor without sound. Darkness consumed the chamber, thicker than before, so complete that even the faint outline of walls vanished. In that black, the whispers cut off in unison. Silence returned, heavy, absolute, pressing so deep it felt like drowning. Then came the breath. One inhale, long and slow, so vast it seemed to draw the air from lungs not its own. One exhale, colder than anything before, rolling through the chamber, pressing against skin, carrying with it the weight of centuries of waiting. The sound of closing followed, doors slamming in sequence one after another, sealing, locking, groaning shut with finality. The chamber tightened, its vastness collapsing inward until the walls pressed close once more. The air burned with cold, every breath searing, every muscle trembling. The shadow moved in the dark, not toward, not away, but everywhere at once, filling the space, surrounding, embracing. The silence stretched to breaking until it fractured, not with a scream, not with a whisper, but with laughter, low, hollow, endless, rising from every surface, vibrating through the bones, a sound that carried no joy, only hunger. The forgotten wing had waited, the forgotten wing had watched, and now the silence had chosen to remember.